Welcome to this new edition of our Let's Talk News Business series. My name is Anita Zielina and I run strategic initiatives here at the Newmark J-School. And in this series, we try to talk about topics and we talk with guests about topics that have to do with the business of journalism, innovation, management, leadership, and entrepreneurship. And this event and the event next week is going to be focused on entrepreneurship, connected to a new program that we will be launching at the school, a new entrepreneurial program. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our host today, my colleague Jeremy Caplan, who runs our entrepreneurial programs here at the school and is going to introduce the panelists.
Thanks, Anita. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm so excited for this conversation. You, Anita, have hosted some really amazing conversations so far in the series. And this is one I'm really excited about because these are two people I so admire, Jenny Aitley and Rose Eveleth. Jenny I've known for a while. Rose I've never actually met in person. I've just had her in my ear listening to the Flash Forward podcast. I was just listening to a recent one about a future in which one-child policy moves across the world and a really interesting discussion about that idea. And what's interesting to me about both of them is that they're both so innovative and creative in so many different ways. And they come from very kind of, I would say, traditional backgrounds in some sense, right? Jenny wrote for the New York Times, has written a best-selling book. Rose has written for BBC and Wired and all sorts of traditional publications and studied science, et cetera. Jenny studied math. And yet now they've kind of broken out of any traditional boundaries, I think, at least from my impression. And so I'm excited to hear from them about that process of breaking out of maybe traditional expectations and moving in new directions with all kinds of new projects. So I'm going to leave the floor to them for the most part. I'm just going to initiate a couple of things. And first is I want to hear just from both of you, if you could just give us a quick update on some of what you're working on now. You have so many different projects going. So just give us a couple highlights each of some things you're working on at the moment this summer as we speak. Rose, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So thank you for having me. I'm really excited. I love to nerd out about this stuff, so I'm excited to talk to folks. Yeah, so I make a podcast called Flash Forward. That's been going for about 5 years. Actually just had the 5-year anniversary a couple of months ago. I think a couple of months ago. Time is like meaningless at this point to me.
200 episodes, right?
114 episodes.
114, okay.
I'll get there. 200 is right around the corner. And so that show's been running independently for a long time. And this summer, I'm actually really excited because a couple of weeks ago, I launched kind of a podcast network to house the projects I'm working on, including Flash Forward, a new show, and then a couple of exciting experiments that are TK coming soon, and just kind of a way to expand out what I'm working on in terms of trying to help people think about the future and understand the future and know what questions to ask when they might see headlines, you know, where two very famous white men are arguing about the singularity and they're like, what does that mean? You know, like, why should I care about that? Or maybe you shouldn't, which is my opinion about that. But so the shows are all kind of trying to exist in that same universe. It's sort of like the Marvel extended cinematic universe, but for my own work and sort of figuring out different ways to monetize the different projects and all of that stuff. So that's kind of what I've been working on. I launched a new show just a couple of weeks ago called Advice for and From the Future, which is just what it sounds like. It's an advice show from the future. We tackle very challenging questions like, you know, your partner was selected to go to Mars, but you don't want to go to Mars. Do you break up? Do you go with them? Like, is a 5-year date like a good idea? You know, like what do you do? So that's sort of where I'm at right now.
Awesome. Very cool. Jenny?
Yeah, so God, it's been a really fun 10 years. So right now I have a couple buckets of projects. I run a literary studio called Plimpton, and we do innovative projects in publishing. So whether, you know, we work with Amazon, New York Public Library, and New York Times, we did a VR film. So that's sort of like the largest number of bodies. We're like, you know, working away on all kinds of projects. Then I work a lot on misinformation. So through founding a credibility coalition, through Hackers, we do a lot of the projects that are in coordination and sometimes sort of arm's length from the platforms like Facebook and Google and Twitter. So I tend to be the fundraiser person there. And I produce some documentaries, and I have a new one on AI that we're working on. We're trying to get over the finish line, except that it's really hard to interview people during lockdown. And my last sort of like the fun thing is I help regulate emojis. I'm a vice chair of the Unicode Emoji Subcommittee. And so a lot of the emojis that have shown up on your phone have come through a little group called Emoji Nation, whose motto is emoji by the people, for the people. And I would say like the last three are probably more the extracurricular. I think I was gonna say like, they're all kind of extracurriculars, but luckily they like generate money, but they're kind of, you know, spiritually like things that you would do for fun, but have, you know, luckily been like sustainable in their own ways.
So there's a lot of exciting things for both of you that are going on. I wonder if you could give us a picture, like a pie chart, because you're doing creative work, right? You're creating your own content in both of your cases. You're also managing multiple projects, managing other people or collaborating with other people. You're also thinking about putting on a business hat, growing your audience, making some money. How do you, like, if you had to put a pie chart together, like what would it look like? What would be the component pieces and how big would they be relative to?
Is that mind share? Is the pie chart mind share or like revenue or like?
I'm thinking of like time you spend, like how much time is spent sitting, writing creatively versus like, you know, business analysis versus like managing other people and sending emails to other people.
Right. So my short thing is, unfortunately, I do very little creative work anymore, just because I tend to be the money person. But like I support a lot of creative projects, and I would say in terms of what, how would I say? So most of the time I'm sitting in front of a computer, especially during COVID. But in terms of like creative development, which is probably the better word, that might be like a third of the time, if that makes sense. And then maybe a third of the time is like contracts and biz dev, like money-y things. A third, you know, and then I don't even know how you would divide the rest of my time. I guess it would be, you know, some slice is just like socializing and trying to like see what other interesting people are doing. And am I the money person? Money tends to be an interesting slice because you'll focus a lot for a long time trying to get like a grant or a deal out the window. And then like once you push it out and get it done and you get everyone on working on it, you kind of recede into the background unless something is like going on. But another way to think of my pie chart would be something like, you know, 30 to 40% on the literary stuff, maybe like 15% to 20% on emoji, 20% on documentaries and film, and then whatever the remainder is on misinformation. So that's sometimes the way that I think about it, like what are the topics rather than how am I spending my time on the topics?
Yeah, that makes sense. Rose, how do you think about how you divide up your time?
Yeah, I would say that it's hard for me because I've tried to really train myself to not separate those things out in that quite that way. In part because I think probably similarly to Jenny, like the creative stuff is the fun stuff. That's the stuff I'm excited about doing and the stuff I like get, you know, I'm like stoked about. And so I have tried to retrain my brain to think of the business side as a type of creative thinking and like a type of thinking that is not totally separate, because otherwise I would just, it feels a little bit soul crushing to me personally. Like, you know, I now enjoy the business side because I have started thinking about it that way. But when I first started, I was like, ugh, like my background is in genetics. I got a degree in journalism at NYU for a master's program, which was great training in journalism, which I needed because I knew absolutely nothing about anything. But there's not a lot of business in that. So I sort of had this mindset of like, oh, well, the business stuff is like the unfun, boring suit stuff that like, I don't want to have to deal with. And I'd like to minimize that if possible. And turns out it's really hard to make a business if you refuse to engage with business. And so I had to kind of rethink the way I was like conceptualizing it in my brain, because otherwise it just wasn't getting done. And so now I sort of think of it as of a piece of the creative side, as it like, are there interesting ways that I could go about doing this? Are there interesting partnerships I could be pursuing? Like Jenny said, like who's doing cool stuff that I could like reach out to and try to kind of like see what they're up to. You know, understanding how other people run their businesses can be really fun. You know, you think of it as ethnography or think of it as interviewing people, like the fun stuff. So it's a little hard for me to break it down. I think if I had to, I would probably say 50-50-ish. I would love for that to be slightly more skewed to the actual editorial creative stuff, obviously, because that's kind of like why I got into this and like what I'm excited about. But I do try to kind of not think of them quite as like binaries where it's like, here's the fun stuff and then here's the stuff you have to do in order to like live and pay your rent and all that.
Mm-hmm. That's a great way of thinking about it. It reminds me of this idea of job crafting, where you sort of have to do certain things, but you can craft them in such a way and reflect them in such a way that they feel more enjoyable, in a way.
It's a little bit of magical thinking. It's fine.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. In terms of the business side, I think that's an area that's the most challenging or the most intimidating for a lot of people. I'm thinking about the journalists out there who are now transitioning from working at news organizations to thinking about, can I do something independently? What are a couple of learnings that you can share with people who are coming from journalism backgrounds, in terms of lessons learned along the way, skill-wise for you, that have helped you to kind of manage your own projects and make them as sustainable as they are?
Yeah. So I'll have like two groups of thought. So one is, what's interesting about being a journalist is traditionally we're not motivated by money, because if we wouldn't have become journalists in the first place, right? And so this is something that I often try to explain to people in Silicon Valley, in terms of just like, it's, how journalists like tick versus like salespeople, very motivated by money. So one thing is, on some intuitive level, personality wise, some people care about like the point keeping score of like how you earn money. And journalists sometimes can train themselves for that. Or ideally you might find the kinds of people who are skilled in like money-ish things, but want to do something more socially meaningful than like getting people to click on like ads, as the best minds of our generation are supposed to be doing. So that's one thought. The other thing is, I think it helps to understand that money is made in probably like different ways, and to understand like the personality and skills that need to go into that. So, one thing that, if I were to break it like, or make it analogy into like fundraising for like a nonprofit, one bucket is like small donors, like people are giving like $25, $100 or whatnot. And those are most analogous to sort of like a consumer-ish business. It's very mathematical, very like driven, like A/B testing, like very relentless, and emails, and just sort of like kind of, it's a very technical kind of mindset to do that. And then you have kind of what I would call sort of like a biz dev, like sales perspective. Those are deals that are in the thousands or the tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands. And those are much more, I would say, like collaborative, and there's also sort of like a hunting kind of mentality to it. Like you're often like waiting and looking and like setting things out, in order for one of those deals to come, to bear fruition. And
like a sponsor, you're talking about a sponsor, for example, kind of thing?
Yeah, sponsors in journalism, to be sponsors, or in the case of like advertising, it could be someone who's going to buy like the back page of your, of the magazine for like a very, very long time. Those tend to be very, more relationship driven. It's not like kind of off the shelf. So you have to have conversations. You have to understand the timeline for that. It's often like 3 to 6 months, sometimes more. And that would be sort of like a major donor type of situation in a nonprofit. And then the sort of the very, very large things, which is what like in fundraising would be like dealing with a foundation. That would be the equivalent of like an enterprise sale, if that makes sense. And those are like very heavy lifting, lots of legal, lots of paper, lots of back and forth, lots of bureaucracy kind of going up and down the chain. And just understanding that the skill sets and patience are different, and not all those kinds of, it would be very surprising for someone to do all of those well.
Interesting.
And if that makes sense. So
yeah.
I think it's sort of understanding the mentality, maybe even intuitively, like what skill set are you kind of designed for? Like I realize that I am not not a B2C person generally. Like I can't do the relentless kind of, very mathematical, very kind of, adding and subtracting, judging cohorts and kind of seeing, what the churn is and all of that. That tends to be more of it sometimes a skill that's prized in Silicon Valley. I'm probably more in the biz dev kind of bucket. And so a lot of the things that we end up doing are sort of what I would call like a B2B play as opposed to B2C plays.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah, it's an interesting way to frame it for people. Rose, what would you say about that?
Yeah, I would two sort of somewhat separate thoughts that are kind of actually related to what Jenny was talking about. And the first thing is I always try to say this when I do talks or conversations around business and going it alone and kind of like building your own thing, which is that not everybody is going to enjoy this or going to want to do this or going to be able to do this. And that is, I think, often said as a like, oh, if you can't cut it, you know, like you don't have whatever. And in fact, I think, you know, some people are just really built to be in a newsroom and some people are really built to work in a certain way and their brains work that way. And that doesn't mean you're not good, you're not smart, you're not a good journalist, none of that stuff. I think there has been a bit of a creep from Silicon Valley, from tech into journalism around like entrepreneurialness and startups and building your thing. And that is great if you like it and if it's fulfilling for you and if that's like suits your personality, awesome, and do it. And I love it and I'm a total evangelist for it. But I think sometimes we get into a situation where somebody who genuinely just like isn't a good fit for that and their skills lie elsewhere are trying to kind of force themselves into it and they're miserable. And it turns out when you're miserable every day, you like won't do a good job and it'll just be terrible. So I think if anyone is like listening or feeling like, oh, like this sounds truly awful and none of this is exciting to me, like that's fine. And that doesn't make you not good at journalism or not like, you know, a piece of this world. So I always try to say that just to like get it out there. A lot of people come to me for freelancing advice, and my first piece of advice is that like not everybody should freelance, and that's totally fine, like 100% fine. The thing I'll say is, you know, I think one of the big lessons I learned, both the hard way and then also some of it is just gut intuition, is trusting your gut. As a journalist, you interview a lot of people, and you get really good actually at kind of like having a sense for people, even with like what they're not actually saying, you know, when you're in an interview and they're not really saying the thing. Asking like the questions that are naive in business deals is actually a really great tactic. If you don't know what someone is talking about when you're in a call about some sort of business thing, pretend it's an interview and just be like, can you just explain this to me? You know, all that stuff. And I think also like trusting your gut in that a lot of people, the cycle for a lot of us who are creative, who often get pulled into this because we're creative and because our ideas don't quite fit necessarily into like traditional newsrooms, is we have this idea, everyone's like, I don't know. We go do it ourselves. And then all of a sudden those people show back up and they're like, hello, we love this thing that you've built that we weren't interested in before. And it can be really tempting to take that money and then give them your IP or give them the thing that you worked really hard to build. And I would say like your value, and this is like, I want to really emphasize this, is like thing you make, your brain and the thing that you make is incredibly valuable. And they're coming to you because they know that they don't have it. So you should retain as much ownership as you possibly can in this business. I mean, especially in like my space, which is podcasting and kind of like that world. There's been a huge conversation recently around hosts not owning the work that they've made, that they've been the face of, particularly hosts of color, like particularly Black hosts. But I've seen it everywhere. Like, you know, you want to start something, you go to a company, you say, hey, I have this amazing idea. They give you a little bit of money and they own everything. And then, wow, like you get successful because, or maybe sometimes not even because of the support of the company that, you know, acquired you or has made the thing, and you don't own any of it. So that's the big thing I would say, is like really be careful with who, like you should own, if you put in, I mean, especially when you're putting in these long hours, your creative spirit and world and sort of like thoughts and sensibilities in this thing, it could not be made without you because you are the person who like really generated it. You should own that. You should own it. And so if anyone comes to you and is like, hey, cool thing you made there, can I buy it from you? Like, there are situations in which that might make sense for you, but be very wary of the people who suddenly show up after you have become successful and want to buy the thing from you, or, you know, any of those sorts of deals. So I would say ownership is the big thing that I bang the drum about a lot.
I'm following up.
I would echo that in terms of, you know, because I'm on the public, so I'm also on the business side of publishing. And I guess coming from the rights, like a very sensitive rights perspective, we create our contracts to be very friendly, right? So something that is very common is someone has something for a window, an exclusive window, and then non-exclusive in perpetuity, but then the rights, the control of the rights then like revert to you, and then you can go resell it. Like, I think that tends to be a very fair structure in certain ways. Another way is to sort of do a rev share where the IP sort of is one layer of the rev share, and you will a nice phrase is always like, we will negotiate in good faith when if a deal ever comes through. But then any work that is done on top of it, whether as a consultant or director or development or whatever, is sort of a different financial layer from the underlying IP, if that makes sense. So I definitely told people to stay away from work for hire. If you're a writer, unless they're paying you really well,
yeah,
and salaried, it shouldn't generally be work for hire if it's a creative work. It's a little bit different if they come to you with the assignment, it's not your pitch, and they're like, can you do this? And then there's also, there's a little bit more of they can replace you easier than you can replace them, I think is the idea. So sometimes I can see the logic for that, especially if they're paying you very fair market rates. But if you're below market rate, you should maintain a piece of the upside.
Just to piggyback on that really quickly, I think I learned this way late, which is as a freelancer, often you're kind of in your own universe and you don't always know what deals other people are being offered, which is sort of a great tool for publishers to use to not give you the good deal if you are especially a person who is just starting out. License agreements are totally normal for people who are very successful, where they license their even features at big fancy magazines. And so they'll tell you that oh, no, we don't do that, but they do that. And so if you can kind of come into it being I don't do work for hire, here's a standard license agreement that I have. So I have one that, my lawyer drew up, and I was like, here's the agreement that I will sign. We can negotiate from this starting point and not that starting point. And that has worked I was like, this is never going to work. And I now have license agreements with almost everybody that I write for. So you have more leverage, I think, than you might think that you do.
That's a great insight. In terms of the starting point, for you both have already built various ventures and sort of at a point where, you have a certain degree of reach and flexibility in how you do things. For those who are kind of on an earlier tier or an earlier stage, they're developing a new idea for a newsletter, or they have an early stage podcast. What kind of time frame do you think people should be thinking about in terms of developing that, building their product, building their community before they're actually generating revenue and starting to think of it as a business? Or do you think that should be built into the beginning and they should be pursuing kind of revenue rate from the start? What are your takes on that?
Do you want to go?
Go for it.
You go first this time.
I think it kind of depends a little bit on what you're trying to build and what your goals are. I would say that it's never a bad thing to start thinking about how you're going to make money on something from the very beginning, right? That's never going to come back to bite you, I don't think. I can sort of speak a little bit to podcasting, right? And I think that, one of the cool things about podcasting now is that there are so many more revenue models, right? It used to be you did a Patreon and you did ads or those are the kind of two things that people would do. And now there's so many other ways you can monetize what you're working on. And I think, even before you make your plan, just getting abreast of what the options are. I am a huge fan of what I sort of jokingly call opposition research, which is just what is everyone else doing, right? If I want to make a podcast, how are all these podcasts that I listen to making money? And sometimes that can be hard to find out. Some shows are very opaque about that, but a lot of people are more and more, I think, sort of public about here's where our money is coming from. There's a great episode of the podcast Call Your Girlfriend where they really break down exactly where their money is coming from, how they're making it. So I think thinking about how you're going to make your money from the beginning is that's a good idea, right? You don't have to have a really, drawn out strategy, but being aware of at least your options from the beginning are important. I think also, some of it is hard to separate out because let's say you're making a podcast and one of the important things you're going to be doing is thinking about who your audience is. And that is inherently also a business question, right? That's an editorial question around who am I trying to talk to? But it's also a business question around are those people who are going to be, Jenny mentioned, donors? Or am I going to people who are going to give me, small sums of money? Or do I really want to make this sort of entrepreneurial documentary series that is probably going to be hard to get in small donations for, but I might be able to go to a foundation for? So thinking about your audience is a sort of also a business conversation. So I think it's kind of hard to separate out those things depending on sort of what you're doing. And yeah, I think just like reaching out to people, I have lots of spreadsheets of like how other shows make money, just to kind of like get a sense for what they're doing and try to kind of back calculate probably how much they're making from the things they're doing. Are they making most of their money from live shows and then pumping that back into the actual production of the podcast, which is obviously not true anymore, but was for a long time. Are they making all their money on merch? Like you can kind of get a sense for like what's going on. Mm-hmm. And that can be like in tandem with, as you think about, what you're doing. And that can also be fun. Like if you see that all these podcasts are making a ton of money on merch, like it's kind of fun to come up with merch ideas, right? You can like have a good time with it. Would be my suggestion. Have fun is my main suggestion.
So I'll answer slightly differently. I think my take, I'm going to answer one slice of what I've observed, especially people are like, should I do this, should I not? Some of the projects that I've worked on started as sort of, like I said, what I would like extracurriculars. And, the misinformation stuff sort of started in that space. The emoji stuff started in that space. And at a certain point, the expectations and the work that you have to do becomes professionalized enough that you need to hire people to do the work, because like the load is beyond what volunteering can do, right? So that means either you don't get to the professional level, or there is money that is coming down the pipeline because there is demand for what you are doing. And sometimes it's sort of like a little clever balance. Like, so for example, the emoji stuff originally started just as like kind of a shake your fist against a world in order to have more inclusive and representative emoji. And now we have like 3 people who like do emoji work part-time, partially because we've gotten, as people say, my cleverness is often trying to figure out like how do you create the business model. And so what happens that we often work with partners. Like we've helped like Tinder with we do an interracial couple emoji, Quip wanted a toothbrush emoji, which is coming to your phone soon. And, those deals are sort of in like the 5 figures. And then, but that money is basically taken to subsidize the creation of like all other kinds of, diverse and representative emoji, like, holidays and the sari and, mate, all of those things. So that kind of got to the point because we couldn't lean on people on favors anymore. And what's, you kind of look around at that point and you figure out like, okay, is there money that can come in that will, grow the amount of the sort of seriousness of the fact that we have to hit deadlines, or we have to like make sure they're deliverables. And what's nice is like when you pay people, they will do work happily oftentimes, especially if it's like cool, interesting work. So for those people, so again, to your original point, which is people who are thinking about something, it may be good to start whatever the project is as a extracurricular where you lean on your favor, like you lean on your own time, you lean on your partner, you lean on like friends up to a certain point. And then at that point you can figure out, is what I'm creating of value enough that someone is either willing to pay from a subscription standpoint, or they're willing to pay, as a sponsor or an advertiser. And then that money can then turn like the volunteer time into something a little bit more professional. And people who do the work don't necessarily have to be salaried or work full time. Like in fact, it might be very fun for them just to have, a quarter time thing to do whatever it is that they can do on the project.
I want to pick up on something. Go ahead, Rose.
Just like, I think that's a great point. Like and another question maybe to ask when you get to that point is like, do I want to keep doing this? Right? Like you don't want to dive into something that you think is going to be great. And then like 6 months in, you have a business plan, you have partners, and all of a sudden you're like, I don't actually like this. Like, I don't want to be spending my time doing this. So like, I do think like stress testing a project or an idea, in some way before you dive deeply into trying to like get financial sponsorship or sell ads on a show or whatever it is definitely a good idea. Just also for your own sanity to not then like be locked into a year's advertising deal for a show that you don't want to be making for another year.
Yeah, that's a great point. I like that term, stress testing it. In terms of that sort of, Jenny, you mentioned these 2 things started out as side project misinfo and emoji, and Rose, it sounds like you have also a lot of kind of side projects that you cook up on the side. Where do you find space and inspiration for that, I guess is my question. So you have a lot to do in the daily routine, right? You've got a bunch of different things to manage, as we talked about earlier. Where do you draw inspiration? How do you carve aside time for that and sort of make it acceptable for yourself to say, okay, I'm going to spend 3 hours watching various documentaries, right? Or I'm going to spend, like for you, Rose, watching, listening to all these different podcasts, which is time consuming. And I'm not, it's not contributing to me today, but it's sort of planting seeds for ideas. So how do you find time for that?
Yeah.
And what specifically do you draw inspiration from?
So as I mentioned, I tend to be the money person behind mission-driven projects, and so that comes in like two different ways. So one is like, I have an interesting idea, like I think I could sell it, or I could raise the money, or I could do the business deal, but then I need someone to execute it. So like one project that I dreamed about in like 2011 when we were just thinking about our serialized fiction was this idea of like were-cougars, which is like women who turn into giant cats, on whatever reason, right? And so that is like kind of hung out with me for a long time. And we tried to do it as fiction, but the writer was male. I was like, and like 2011 till now is a long time. But when serialized narrative podcasting came around, I was like, oh, like could this work better as a podcast? And you kind of find the right team members who can get excited. So one guy was like a sound engineer that worked with me on a VR film. Another one is like my friend's wife is a trans satirical playwright and was like, yes, like about bodily transformation, so we just kind of gathered a little team together, and then there was a deadline for, an application, like some kind of process, right? And then you're like, okay, this is great, because even when we don't get it, it's like a great forcing function. So oftentimes you're just like carrying your idea and then like recruiting people until it happens. The other way is someone comes to you for the idea, like for our VR film based on Lincoln Navarro for the New York Times. It was my friend who I met him for lunch, and he was like, oh, Penguin Random House wants to do this VR film, but they can only do like, I don't know, it was like 12,000, 15,000. It wasn't very much money, which is like, but a fraction of what you needed for a VR film at that time. And I was like, I think I can sell this to someone. And then, just sort of like text and email and whatever. And the New York Times came on as basically financed the whole thing in the end, which wasn't, it didn't start out financing it. They started out a little bit. And then like with the rights, again, it gets into the whole rights situation that they actually, I think, did end up owning in the end. That was a very messy, actually. This is something that I will add, which is one thing that we should appreciate about media, for better or worse, is that a lot of the rights situations have become settled. And that's why deals can be done really fast. Where a lot of time and kind of angst takes place is at the edges or in new forms where the business models are not settled. And so the contracts are not just kind of boilerplate at that point. And so you're spending a lot on legal, you're kind of battling back and forth. And so there is something nice when there is a known equilibrium, whether or not it's because the WGA has contracts or because, this is just the way that, freelance or not freelance, like writing contracts are done. So that's it. So either I just like carry an idea and then get people excited, or people want something and they come to me and then I was like, can I find the money behind to make this happen? And then sometimes that's very quick, like, and that was like a week or two for the VR film, and sometimes it's like years, like 9 years for our little Were-Creepers adventure, which is still not over, actually.
Is the Were-Creepers thing? Can I listen to that somewhere? Because I really want to.
So we have a pilot script at this point, and we literally we finished the pilot script. What is today? We finished it Monday. So
I'm so excited.
Yeah, because the international IFP, what is film? Independent Film Project, I guess. They do a marketplace for documentaries every fall where they have financiers and creators, and we've done it for docs, but this is the first year doing it for podcasts. So you can pitch, you have to make a deck. We didn't have a deck. I mean, we made everything from scratch. I mean, it literally was like, this is due in 2.5 weeks. Let's go, guys. But it's nice, because now I have a thing that is enough to then go out with and talk to people and like develop it, right? It might not be exactly the vision they have, but they're kind of interested. And everyone's kind of along for the ride at this point for an extracurricular, but at a certain point it might turn on and become professional.
That's cool.
That's great. So there's this book called The Artist's Way, which is like very like woo-woo in many ways, and a lot of people roll their eyes at it, and I totally get that. I have found that some of the advice in there is really helpful in terms of like figuring out how to get yourself thinking creatively, and kind of like, I read it when I was like very stuck, you have those moments where you're like, oh, I have like no ideas and I don't know what I'm doing, and well, like, what do I want to be doing? And one of the things that that book has in there is a practice called morning pages, which is you write 3 pages every morning. And I do it. I've been doing it for years now. And that is where a lot of and I commit that time. So in the book, it's a lot of like, sort of like therapy, like processing emotions around creative, etc. That is not what I use it for. I use it for every week. I have these various extracurricular ideas or projects, or like, I have a screenplay I want to write or whatever. And so on my calendar, I say like, this week morning pages are about like this project. And so every morning I handwrite 3 pages, like creative writing or whatever development or whatever it is I need to be thinking about on that project. And it's just like a little by little chipping away kind of thing. It feels great in many ways, because then at the end of the week you have like a bunch of pages that you've written on this thing, and much like everything, a lot of those first drafts are not good, or like those ideas don't make any sense, but it is a way to kind of like start thinking about it. And so I'm really committed to that. I also block off my Fridays. I don't take phone calls, I don't do business stuff. Fridays are for like creative stuff. Obviously, like there sometimes have to be exceptions to that, but like I try to be pretty strict about Fridays, as like that is my day where I like turn off my email notifications, I put my phone in the other room, and I try to really just like either read a bunch of stuff or listen to a bunch of stuff, or like marinate in whatever it is that I'm trying to kind of think about. And I mean, I block off time for listening. I feel like I sort of really need to be keep abreast of like what people are doing in podcasting. Embrace the 2 times listening speed. It's fine. Like I have no problems with people listening to things at double speed. Listen to my shows at double speed. I don't care. I think like there's only so much time in the day. Like we all need to get everything done. So, my opinion about double speed is you have to earn single speed from me. Like if I feel like I can really slow down and like I want to, sink into the show, I will slow you down, but you have to earn it. You have to earn the 1x from me. It's 2x or otherwise. So that's kind of some of my tips. The other thing in The Artist's Way is that she recommends, which I'm not always good about, but I try to do, is weekly artist dates, which is you take yourself on a date to a thing. And that can literally just be like a walk in your neighborhood where you like are like, I'm going to just notice the flowers. It doesn't have to be to an art gallery, but it's sort of like something that kind of gets you out of your routine, to get you looking at stuff, to get inspiration. And I find that good. The other book I would recommend on sort of like creativity is called Big Magic, which again, like there's a lot of stuff in that book that's very like mystical, but there are a couple of really great reminders in that book that like just because you had the idea and you didn't do anything with it doesn't mean that someone else, like you can't get mad if somebody else did something you thought about doing but didn't do. It's like a lot of like sort of fire under the butt stuff that I find really helpful to kind of like get your gears going and sort of start trying to think about like how can I actually do the things that I have in my brain? How do I like make them real?
That's great. There's a lot of good stuff there. We can take a couple questions if people have questions to throw them in the Q&A. Somebody wants to know about Alyssa wants to know about the first creative breakthrough you had in terms of making the business part creative and fun, and also something that made some money. So maybe you can just share an experience, like a positive early experience that was sort of like validating, the vision you had for one of your projects.
Yeah. Actually, this was probably, so lots of times at the end of 2009, and then like in 2011, and Kindle had come out in like 2007, and I was like really fascinated with digital publishing, right? Because I really felt that, digital publishing as a form of pushing out, books or whatever would fundamentally change the kind of thing that we publish, because the form and the rights and the fact that you could like publish everywhere, whereas opposed to like books oftentimes assumed an object, and they assumed like you would have geographic distribution within a range. So we became really interested in serialized fiction, because we just felt like that was a very natural kind of cadence of, wherever publishing was going. And I still think it hasn't gotten there yet, but we're seeing directionally the fact that it's like little sprouts pop up, and I think that's in part because the right product and distribution fit haven't come together. Anyway, so we were doing serialized fiction, and actually originally this is where the Ware Cougars idea came from. And what we quickly figured out as a small little entity is that we did not have the distribution mechanism for it. Like at that point, you couldn't like pour money in and like have better ebook distribution, because there's just a good way to advertise or whatever. And so then what happens, our team 4 split into 2. Like one team went on and actually built that like how do you help market ebooks? And that is now a company called BookBub, which is actually doing really, really quite well. And then two of us who are writers were like, we're not that interested in marketing, but like go you. And kept little pieces of each other's company. And then we just kind of focused on the serialized fiction for a while, and sort of like as a part-time thing. And then like someone, so this is another piece of advice. Constantly have conversations, because someone is working on something and they need something. So we had a contact at Amazon who told us that like he heard that Amazon was working on like serialized fiction. And this was such an interesting reason why they were working on serialized fiction, because it did not come from an editorial perspective. It came from the fact that they needed to update the Kindle team, so the product tech team needed to update the Steve Jobs biography or something, but like update in a way that didn't erase people's notes. So they had technically had to figure out how you like change a book underneath without changing like what was already there. And then from that, they're like, well, what else can we do with this technology? And they're like, we could grow books, and then so in that way they're like, let's just make books grow. And it became like serialized fiction, which is a very strange thing, and probably not the way that you would design it from scratch if you're thinking about it from an editorial perspective. But therefore, from within the Kindle product team, they're like, let's do serialized fiction. And they basically came to us, and at first it was just like, do you want to publish on this? And then as the conversations often go with biz dev, they want more and more and more, but often when they want more and more and more, they'll pay more and more and more. And so ultimately, again, this gets into the right situation. They acquired our series for a 7-year exclusive, so it's done. I think it's done. So we have it probably non-exclusive again. And that was sort of a big debate. 7 years, 5 years, like those things actually do matter, because the time does pass. And then what happens is it's nice if you build a body of IP that you can like manipulate or use or kind of like leverage in some ways. Anyway, so that was the situation. Like you have your idea, and then someone else has the same problem, and they often have money, and then are willing to give you money to help them solve that problem.
That's cool. Yeah. It's like, it seems like a lot of what you've said has come around to like having these discussions, sort of being open to things and sort of gathering, we used to call it gathering string, right? And like sort of waiting for the right moment, and then there's a forcing function and you can actually proceed. Rose, any additional thoughts on that?
I think,
go ahead.
Go ahead. I think some of it is, a very small example is for podcasts, we do ads, right? And like it's host read ads, and there are a couple of ways you could do ads where you can just like read them and like you fulfill your ad, needs, and you get paid and everything. And I was sort of thinking a little bit about like, what could I do around making sure people don't skip the ads, which is a thing that people do. I myself am guilty of. And also, kind of trying to think about ways to make sure that advertisers feel like they can come back, right? And like that they want to buy on the show. And obviously that is in part driven by, do your ads get people to buy the product? But there's a lot of other softer things that actually drive an advertiser to come back to you. And so I spent a little while thinking about like, how can I make my ads sort of like more fun? And now I've sort of totally changed the way I do ads on the show. And I have sponsors who now come back every year, because they're like, even if the show isn't actually moving that much product, they feel like, because people will literally tweet being like, I love the ads on this show, which is like something no one ever says. So I've made them a lot more fun. I do a thing on Flash Forward, which is there are always sort of like hidden references, often to like old sci-fi or like other things, and I will often put the references in the ads. And if you catch one, you get a prize from me. So if you email me being like, I got a reference, I'll like mail you a sticker, or you can get like, I have a playlist of all the music I've ever used on the show. And so like little things like that, which are actually kind of fun for me, honestly. Like it's kind of fun to be able to like figure out how to hide these little things inside of ads and whatever. I never thought when I was in journalism school I would be like, I'm having a good time writing advertisements, but like it is what it is, and the sponsors really love it and they come back every year. So like that's been just like a small example of like making you retaining these relationships. And then they're also now willing to like sponsor new shows. I have this new podcast, and it doesn't have a listeners yet, right? Like when I was first launching it, I was like, I don't have like a number for you, but because we have this relationship and they know that I do good ads and they know that like people like them and they're fun and it's going to be weird, they're kind of willing to take that risk with me on a new show that they've never even heard. So those sorts of relationships sort of in that way have been really helpful. And the other thing I'll say is so there can be some sort of like fun, creative brainstorming when you're starting to think about like, okay, I have my thing that I want to do. I'm going to make a list of maybe organizations or nonprofits or even like companies that might be interested. And how can I kind of like come up with a fun way for us to work together? Like partnerships can be really fun to think about. So, I did a partnership with an organization and I pitched them and I was like, hey, you're really interested in this idea. I'm interested in this idea. What if I developed like a live choose your own adventure game for your audience at your big annual conference and you all got to play it and like then you sponsored whatever. And that was like, I got to write this like really fun game and
Cool.
They loved it. The audience loved it. They asked me to come back and do it again the next year. And now they're going to sponsor stuff for the show and stuff like that. So like, just like it doesn't have to be like a slog to think about business. You can sort of like have fun with it. And I think also like, that comes through when you're pitching to people. If they like, you're not just like sending the form email being like, please give me money. I would like money from you for things. If you're like, I have this cool idea and I'm excited and like I have interesting things to say, like people pick up on that and they want to be a part of that. And like even people who work in like super like analytical business, like Jenny said, like they get excited when you have a fun idea for them to work on. Like people like that kind of stuff.
Right. And I just,
yeah, that's very inspiring. Great.
Sort of building upon what she's saying, it's often good to understand what your counterpart in the organization's motivations are. Oftentimes, like, is it like, for one of our partners was this, they need one bullet point for the slide on the quarterly presentation for the CEO, or like the cool and innovative things that we did this, this year or this quarter, right? Or it's like they need to impress their boss, they need to move their needle, they need to do this, they need to like end up, moving sales. And there's understanding sort of marketing like generally falls into two buckets. So one is what I would call like, direct response or performance marketing, that, sort of like the Googles and Facebooks of the world kind of excel Instagram, where you basically pay, they want to put money in and have someone come out and buy something, right? The other kind of general kind of category is what I call like brand marketing, right? Which is like lifting up awareness and kind of like general warm fuzziness of a brand, and sometimes being associated with something cool very much is part of that. So like, Tinder sponsoring the interracial couple emoji, they want a Webby, they got a bunch of people engaged, they did a full page ad in the New York Times celebrating the emoji. That actually, and then like totally randomly and unexpectedly, it also drove downloads like 60%. I think it was like 60% month over month, or like a year ago. And it was interesting to see like they went in for one and it ended up doing the other. But you want to understand your counterpart. How can I help them do what they need to do?
So I want to listen to both all day. I feel like I've learned a number of different things and got a number of different cool ideas. So thank you so much for these ideas. I want to give you a chance to just share a final thought before we conclude, and let you get back to all the cool things you do. One thing I know I'm curious about is sort of open spaces. There's all of these platforms out there, and there's all of these topics that are undercovered and groups that are underrepresented. I just wonder if you have an idea that's kind of bubbling up about something new and interesting, or an opportunity that might be out there for people, or any other thought you want to conclude with is also okay.
Yeah. So I have two thoughts that are not those thoughts, but these are hard-word thoughts. So one is work with people who are high competency, low drama. Like high drama is just not worth it, not worth your bandwidth, not worth for all the meetings, just high competency, low drama. That's like a good profile. The other thing is 5 to 7 people is your ideal number, size to get something done without bureaucracy, if that makes sense. So
okay, yeah, I love the specificity of that. That's great.
That's great. I second all of that. High competency, low drama. I've never heard it said that way, but that is like perfect. Like that is it's like you're going to be so busy, like you don't have time to like deal with like
emotions.
No. Yeah. I would say that I actually think that now is an interesting time. I want to be a little bit careful in how I phrase this, because I think there's a lot of like, particularly tech people being like, now is the time to disrupt, and now is the time to blah, blah, blah. And like some people are just trying to survive, and that is like 100% valid. And, you don't have to be like inventing a new thing right now amidst a pandemic and like a national crisis around police brutality. Like you're good. You're doing fine. The thing I will say is one thing I'm a little bit excited about just on like my side of things when it comes to things like podcasts and some of these sort of like experimental audio things is that some of the sort of technical barriers or sort of artificially imposed technical barriers around like what things should sound like to be professional, quote unquote, are sort of coming down a little bit because everyone's trying to figure out how to record from home and everyone's kind of trying to figure out what this looks like. And that might actually be a really great place to start something. Because, you know, it's very funny. I've made Flash Forward on my own for forever, and I've always sort of sorted out my own tape, and it's always been fine. And to watch a lot of like beloved friends at NPR like lose their minds being like, what do you mean we don't have a studio and I don't know what to do? And just like, I'm like, you're gonna be fine. It's totally gonna be fine. Like everything's gonna be fine. So just thinking about like, you know, not getting too caught up on some of the technical, like how does it sound? Does it like, do I have the right microphone? Now's a really great time to just try stuff. Everyone's just trying stuff right now. And I think that it's a really great time to actually, especially the way that Jenny talked about, like stress test maybe one of those ideas that you had and like see if you can get some traction, see if people will connect with it. It's sort of a fun time to start thinking about what else there could be. I mean, I, as a person who thinks about the future all the time, there are a lot of things to be very sad and scared about right now, but there's also, I think, a really interesting thing happening where like, we're all sort of starting to imagine futures in new ways that didn't seem possible even 6 months ago. And I think harnessing that and thinking about what that could mean for you, either in your professional or personal life, can be really freeing and exciting. And just like take the swing. Why not?
Thank you so much. This has been an awesome, at least from my perspective, an awesome conversation that just hearing from you about all the different things you're working on, lots of different ideas, lots of cool ways of thinking about things. So thank you so much. Next week we have Nick Chen and Michelle Young for another conversation, which I'm really excited about. Same time, same bat channel, 11 o'clock next Wednesday. So if everyone wants to join again, please do. And you can follow these guys, Rose and Jenny, through the links I shared, and you can find them all over the webs, and there lots of cool stuff to follow. So especially their Plimpton and Flash Forward, great stuff. So thank you both. Thanks everyone for being here today. Thank you both for spending time with us and sharing so many ideas and inspiration, particularly the inspiration that's really great to have during these sometimes dark days. It's great to hear about people doing really creative, cool work and sharing ideas with us. So thanks so much. Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for having us. This is fun.
It's super fun.